supposing the U.S. invades Iraq in 2003, and I don't like it. And I go on campus and I have a rally and I burn an American flag and I say, the empire, it's a fascist, militaristic. What would happen to me? Nothing. I'm protected by explicit Supreme Court rulings. So burning an American flag is not a punishable offense. It's an expression of sentiment. But if I burn an Israeli flag and I upset my Jewish students and faculty members of my community because it intimidates them, it makes it seem as if I'm anti-Zionist, I'm pro-Hamas, that's going to be enjoined. How can that be justified? Hello, Rajiv. How are you?
Hi, Glenn. Fine, thank you.
This is Glenn Loury. This is The Glenn Show, and I'm with Rajiv Sethi. I teach at Brown University and am host of The Glenn Show, Glenn Loury, host of The Glenn Show. And Rajiv is a professor of economics at Barnard College, Columbia University, and an old friend and collaborator, colleague of mine. So it's good to welcome you back, Rajiv, to The Glenn Show.
Thanks, Glenn. Very happy to be back.
So what's going on with you in your life these days?
Well, Columbia, as you know, has been in the news quite a bit, and Barnard with it. Been involved with various activities on campus, trying to see what the faculty can do, put our heads together to deal with the issues that we're facing, which are quite grave, as you know. That's part of it. And then, of course, my usual research and teaching.
Yeah, I certainly want to talk about what's going on at Columbia and more broadly in American higher education. The audience should know that you are, in addition to being a fine economist, scholar, and teacher, also the author of a very informative newsletter that you call Imperfect Information, which people can find at Substack. And I don't know, for the last year or so, you've been periodically posting your commentary on the thing that now seems to be reaching its culmination in the Trump administration's conflict with and assault on elite higher education. I teach at Brown, you teach at Columbia. We are embedded within the beast, so to speak. And I've just learned a lot from your post. I think it's worthwhile sharing that with the audience. So what do you see? You saw this coming, did you not?
Yes. Actually, I wrote a post almost a year ago today, April 2024, well before the election, when Biden was actually still the presumptive nominee of his party, and it was called Minority Report, and I was taking a position that was in opposition to what most of the faculty here at the time were taking, which was a vote of no confidence in the president. And I thought that we needed to put our heads together and put down, sort of move away from the circular firing squad. Otherwise, we were going to be in a lot of trouble. And at the last couple of paragraphs of that post, I pointed out that American higher education does a lot for the U.S. economy, both in terms of exports. Tuition payments and living expenses of students count as our exports, and we have a balance of trade deficit that is tempered a bit by that, and also as being responsible for various high technology innovations that fuel many sectors of the economy, and so on. So there's a lot that we do for the economy, but the trust in higher education has fallen precipitously. You can look at Gallup polling data, for example, and it's not just among Republicans. So among Democrats and independents, really the confidence in higher education has dropped a lot for reasons that we can discuss, some of which I think are legitimate. We can't attribute this just to propaganda against higher education. And the point I was making in that post was that unless we address the legitimate critiques and rebuild the trust that we once had, that no amount of prestige or accumulated wealth would save us from disaster. I think that's roughly what I said in that post, and we're facing that disaster now.
What are the things needing to be addressed, in your opinion, legitimately complained about by the Trump-Vance administration?
Well, I mean, there are several of these. One has to do with a certain hypocrisy when it comes to free speech. So, for example, you had a geophysicist, Dorian Abbott from Chicago, whose lecture at MIT was canceled. You might remember that.
Oh, I know Dorian pretty well, actually, through the University of Austin, where we're both academic affiliates.
So that lecture was canceled. He was not speaking on affirmative action, which was the issue on which, the issue that raised concern at MIT. And basically his thoughts on affirmative action, which are really not that different, I don't think, than yours over the course of your career at various points in time. But it was entirely unrelated to the talk he was going to give, and that was canceled. That's sort of one example. A few years ago, there was a disruption at Columbia of a class taught by Lee Bollinger, and that was related to a labor dispute. That class was interrupted immediately and then canceled, the class itself, and so on. So I think that there are a number of examples that you could take. There was a case of a young Columbia student, a sophomore at the time. I think the name was Julian Van Abel, who was recorded as basically praising white people for creating modern civilization and technology and so on and so forth. And, some of that language, of course, echoes what one hears from white supremacists and out and out racists. But if one is going to allow for speech that others consider harmful, that's certainly not beyond the pale. And he was banned from Barnard campus. These are just some examples. You can think of several others, I imagine.
Yeah, a federal judge being shouted down at Stanford Law School.
The way in which free speech has been conceived, at least by some people, and I don't think that this is everybody by any means, but you're right. Judge Duncan at Stanford was prevented effectively from giving his remarks, and that's an exercise of the heckler's veto. That's clearly against what are called the Chicago Principles on academic freedom and free speech. And there was a very, very good response to that by the dean of the Stanford Law School, Jenny Martinez. She's now the provost of Stanford, I believe. And pointed out that free speech includes the right of people to listen to those that they would like to consult. And if you heckle and disrupt, that is a violation of the free speech rights of others. So that's one issue, the issue of speech. There has been a sort of inconsistent application of this idea, and that really calls into question some hypocrisy with regard to the way in which the term is used these days. So that's one example, but there are others.
Now, the intolerance for certain kinds of ideas being expressed is a reflection of ideological homogeneity of the environment, is it not?
To some extent, I think that's right, Glenn. But I think, honestly, if you take any particular profession, you take plumbers or electricians, or you might take, car dealers or whatever, you're going to find some sort of ideological skew. Now, of course, higher education is different because you're engaged in education, you're engaged in conversation, building and communicating ideas. So you might want to have more ideological heterogeneity or viewpoint diversity, and I agree with that. But I do think, honestly, and I think the way in which we are characterized by some people is unfair. Most people sort of set these things aside. You're teaching a class in chemistry or computer science. You walk into the classroom and you really do your job. You care about the students, and the ideology you might or might not hold doesn't really play a role in your day-to-day activities. Now, that's not true for certain types of classes, of course, that where ideology becomes quite central. But the way in which the institutions are characterized, I think, is really quite unfair. And it's possible for people, if you have 80% of people in a particular profession who hold one set of views that differs from that of the average person in the population, they can still do their jobs quite well. So I think one needs to separate this a bit. But I do think viewpoint diversity is a very important thing to have on campus. And that's part of the reason for the loss of trust. That is correct.
What about the protests? Columbia has been ground zero, it seems to me, for since the war in Gaza was launched after the events of October 7th, 2023. Hasn't the presence of anti-Zionist sentiment being vociferously expressed by protesting students contributed to this crisis environment that we now seem to be entering?
Well, it certainly created a crisis for Columbia because that's ground zero. That's been the most visible of all campuses with regard to these protests. But one of the points that I made in a recent post, you mentioned my Substack, is that the opposition to higher education, the inclination to attempt to take over these institutions, which are very well endowed, you've got close to $1 trillion in aggregate endowments, was formulated 4 years ago. If you listen to speeches by JD Vance, for example, or Chris Rufo, your colleague at the Manhattan Institute, or
that's Christopher Rufo, I assume you're referring to.
Yes. Or if you see what happened with New College of Florida, for example, which was transformed quite dramatically in the hope of making it a sort of a Hillsdale College of the South. So these kinds of ideas have been.
Let me just explain to people, that's a small public university campus, a part of the University of Florida system, which had a specialized mission and a particular cast of ideological orientation in its faculty that Governor Ron DeSantis made a point of taking over and making an example out of, transforming it through reconstituting its board and muscular intervention in its curriculum and faculty appointment processes toward creating a ideologically more balanced, he would say, environment for higher education in Florida. An example was made of it.
Yeah.
And Rufo, actually, this is the writer at the Manhattan Institute who's made a good deal of impact through his criticisms of diversity initiatives around the country, and particularly in higher education, and exposing plagiarism of former President Claudine Gay at Harvard and other such activities. He's been involved, Rufo has, in the Florida initiative as well.
That's right. But the point I was making about Rufo and others, JD Vance in particular, I would say, is that what's being implemented now with regard to policy pertaining to higher education was imagined 4 years ago, before October 7th attacks, before any protests, before encampments, building occupations, sit-ins, class disruptions, or the distribution of material that has violent and anti-Semitic rhetoric. Now, all of those things have happened, but my claim is that had none of that happened, you would still be seeing something roughly similar to what we're seeing right now, except that I don't think it would have been Columbia first in line to face these things. It probably would have been Harvard, maybe Yale or Princeton, the ones with the largest endowments. And the attempt to remake these universities along a totally different set of criteria would have been implemented, I believe, by the current administration, independently of the protests. But of course, the protests put a target on the backs of Columbia. And so Columbia becomes the first in line.
So what do you say to the argument that the universities have no one to blame but themselves? They become bloated and overpriced and ideological in their orientation and corrupt in a certain sense in terms of the embrace of ideas and ways of looking at the world that are inconsistent with American democracy, prosperity, global leadership, whatever, and have painted a target on their own backs by doing so, not only in terms of inhibiting other people's speech, but in terms of the kind of speech that gets celebrated and the kind of initiatives, the DEI mania and emphasis on that kind of stuff.
I'd say
so. Loss of public confidence in the universities, complaints from donors about the biased character of instruction and so forth and so on.
I'd say that there's some merit to those charges. I think they have to be examined one by one and seen exactly to what extent they apply, but I think there is merit to them. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is that the FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, it's an organization that, in my opinion, has sort of taken the place of the ACLU as as a defender of free speech of all kinds. They have been extremely consistent, in my opinion. So, for example, expressed real concerns about the deportation of Mahmoud Khalil, for instance, who was arrested on our campus. But FIRE's faculty survey that was released in December of last year found that 89% of faculty respondents from Columbia engaged in some degree of self-censorship. The number one issue was on the Israel-Palestine conflict, but second, quite a distant second, but still a second, was affirmative action. So there are many issues on which there's a great deal of self-censorship by faculty on campuses, and that's a product of the things that you're describing. If keeping one's standing in the community requires you to abstain from making certain kinds of remarks, you're going to see self-censorship. You've written extensively about this in your own work. I'll give you one more example. Dartmouth and MIT have restored standardized testing for admissions. And Dartmouth actually found that that moving to test optional hurt some students from lower income backgrounds. There's a very detailed, thorough study establishing this by Dartmouth faculty. And people were abstaining from submitting scores when, given their background and their environment, they would have benefited from submitting those scores. So Dartmouth actually reversed themselves. But most other places, Barnard and Columbia included, I believe, have not done that. And that raises concerns among people that there's a sort of, keeping vagueness, keeping a shroud of secrecy on exactly how admissions processes are conducted invites suspicion. And that's another example of practices that I think people don't particularly like in the general public.
Yeah, let me expand on that point. The Supreme Court's 2023 decision in the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and the University of North Carolina, which found racially preferential affirmative action inconsistent with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, barring preferential affirmative action in college admissions, at least by state universities and those who are receiving federal funds under relevant statutes, is the problem that suspending the requirement to submit standardized tests as a condition of application is meant to get around, in that you would calculate that if you make use of the standardized testing information, it will disproportionately exclude students of color whom you're trying to include within your ambit, but you're not able to specifically identify and prefer. So rather than accept the consequence of applying standardized testing standards, which would be a reduced number of students of color, you suspend the standard.
That's the suspicion. Now, the response from Dartmouth is that actually getting a diverse class, at least socioeconomically diverse class, requires the submission of these scores, because people are mistakenly withholding scores when they ought to be submitting them. And the reason they give, the primary reason, is the following. In compliance with the Supreme Court ruling, Dartmouth and many other schools will take a test score relative to the distribution of scores from the institution from which you're applying. It's similar in spirit to the Texas 10% policy, or the similar policies in California and Florida, where basically people who do extremely well in an institution where most people do quite poorly academically are thought to have unusually high potential. This is the basic idea. And so what Dartmouth does is, it's not just Dartmouth, by the way, but the report is so clear and so good, I'm mentioning their work. What they will do is that they'll, given two people with roughly similar scores, they'll have a preference for the one that is coming from a school with the lower distribution of scores. So your relative standing matters, in your school matters, as well as your absolute performance. And the people who were withholding their scores were people whose absolute performance may not have been that great compared to those who are typically admitted to Dartmouth, but whose relative standing is so stellar that they would have that withholding their scores actually lowered their prospects of admission. This is the argument. So yes, the suspicion is that if you don't have if you don't require these scores, if you're test optional, or if you prohibit even the submission of scores, you're trying to circumvent the Supreme Court ruling in some way. That's the suspicion. But there are reasons to require the score that have nothing to do with that. This is the argument that I'm making on behalf of Dartmouth.
I see. Those reasons being that the relative performance of a student could be a strong signal about their unobserved latent potential.
Exactly
and
right.
It's not available to the admissions committee if they don't submit their scores. And they incorrectly calculate that the absolute low level of their scores would be a barrier to them and don't take into account this relative effect.
Exactly right. You expressed it much better than I did. And in fact, they provide empirical support for the fact that people are making these kind of strategic errors in the decision to submit or not submit scores.
But now I can recall commentary after the Supreme Court's landmark decision overturning affirmative action amongst faculty and administrators in elite higher education that this was a barrier to be worked around. I mean, open declarations of their intent to continue to reflect, quote, their values, close quote, in terms of promoting diversity, notwithstanding the constraints that the Supreme Court decision implied. And doesn't that then justify in some measure the kind of reaction that you'd get from a JD Vance? These people are dug in, they're blinkered, they have an agenda, they're going to subvert the law. And the intensity of the anti-diversity sentiments that have been expressed by the president's this new administration and its executive orders and so on, they're not wrong, are they, to think that the institutions are resistant to, as it were, the will of the people as expressed in the electoral outcomes of 2024?
Well, the electoral outcomes are one thing. Let's talk about the Supreme Court first. I mean, the Supreme Court does not say that diversity, even racial diversity, is not a legitimate goal. They say that taking into account people's race in the application, in the admissions process, is illegitimate. It's constitutionally not permitted. Now, there are many, many ways in which you could achieve a diverse pool of admitted students that are in compliance with the Supreme Court ruling. For example, you could have a score threshold that matches, let's say, the median of your previous historically admitted students, and admit by lottery above that threshold. That's something that is race neutral. That is something that what in your work you have called colorblind selection policy. It would be in compliance with the Supreme Court ruling, but it could well be motivated by diversity as a goal. I don't think the Supreme Court excludes that. And that's one example.
I think let me just interrupt for a minute because I want clarification on this. It's not at all clear to me that the Supreme Court doesn't preclude. I mean, that's a difference between the treatment of applicants, which might be racially biased or not, and the goal of the institution, which might be racially, quote, biased in the sense of they want to promote a greater racial diversity. And it's not clear to me how that distinction is drawn in Justice Roberts' opinion.
You're right, Glenn. You're right, because he does make explicit. He talks about the fact that people could mention how their own race affected their life experiences in their essays, for example, and this could legitimately be taken into account in deciding, something about the individual character of the person. Right. But, and he's quite clear about this, it could not be used as a sort of a back channel, as a sort of disguised way of taking race into account to assemble a racially diverse class. My point about the lotteries is that, what it does is it gives you a diverse class along all kinds of different dimensions. It's not, you can't avoid, like the Texas 10% policy, which I think is perfectly consistent with the Supreme Court ruling. It was in fact a response to the restrictions on the use of affirmative action in Texas, and other states by the Supreme Court. So
I think it was the Fifth Circuit Court that
it was the Fifth Circuit
actually
Court. That's right.
triggered the Texas.
You're absolutely right. So yeah, I'm not a legal scholar. I should.
Yeah, neither am I.
I think you have a better understanding of these things than I do.
But, I've been writing about affirmative action since forever.
That's right.
So.
That's right. But as far as I know, a lottery-based system would not be in violation of the order. But maybe I'm wrong.
Let's talk about Middle East, South Asian, and African studies at Columbia. Let's talk about the curriculum, about the teaching of history, global affairs, politics, critical studies, and whatnot. Part of, you said circular firing squad, and I assume you're referring to the conflict between administration and faculty over the governance of the university in the face of these external pressures. Among the demands coming from the Trump administration to Columbia University is an insistence that the Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies Department be under new governance to presumably correct for, I can put quotes around these words, the biases and the way that they teach their classes and do their scholarship. It looks like Columbia's administration, Katrina Armstrong and the board, are going to capitulate. I just read in the newspaper this morning to the administration's demands in this respect. And I would imagine that there would be a lot of consternation in Columbia's faculty about this capitulation as a surrendering of academic freedom and the autonomy, the intellectual autonomy of the university to external political pressures. And I'm just wondering, do I get that right? And what's going on in these early days after the announcement of the capitulation?
You're right on both counts, about the capitulation and about the consternation. So with regard to the capitulation, it's not just the demand to put the MESAAS department, the Middle East and South Asian African Studies department, into receivership. That was the demand made by the federal agencies as a precondition for beginning a conversation about restoring the funding that Columbia had lost. But that was not the only demand. There were many other demands. Included in them, among those demands was a demand that the public safety officers have the power to arrest and remove students from campus, that the judicial board be disbanded effectively, that admissions policies be changed, and so on. There's a long list of demands. And there's been capitulation, if you like. I just wrote a post this morning about this, and it'll be interesting to see whether it will be seen eventually as capitulation or strategic retreat. Let me explain that in a second. But
this is your lion roaring post?
Yes,
I think I read that before we signed on.
I just posted it maybe an hour ago. That's right. Yeah, the lion had roared. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of demands that are made by the administration. Let me step back a little bit and talk about the initial denial of funding, the $400 million in grants and contracts that was canceled. And the justification for that was the inability or unwillingness of the university to take action against the harassment of Jewish students on campus. So it was antisemitism was the justification for the freezing of the funds.
Right.
That was 2 weeks ago. The president of Columbia, President Armstrong, responded with a statement that outlined a series of steps that Columbia had already taken and that was strengthening to combat anti-Semitism on campus. And in that statement, described the eradication of anti-Semitism as her number one priority. So that was the response to the cancellation of funds. Now, in response to that response, the federal agencies came back with this set of demands that you just mentioned. The public safety officers, the admissions policy, the MESAAS department, receivership, and so on and so forth, a whole bunch of demands. And basically said that Columbia had a week to respond to this letter. And this was a precondition for any conversation about the restoration of funding. So it was very hard-nosed response. And the reason I mention this history going back 2 weeks is precisely because of what we had discussed earlier, that what's happening to higher education was imagined and conceived 4 years ago, before there was any hint of encampments or protests. They were before October 7th, in fact. So what is being done right now is putting into place a plan that, that has anti-Semitism as a justification in the first place, but really goes far beyond that in terms of to paraphrase JD Vance, take over or destroy these institutions. These are the words that he used in a podcast conversation 4 years ago. Right, that was the goal: take over or destroy. And what has been done, what President Armstrong has done in her reply, is to basically concede to every single one of these demands. She does it using the language of being true to the university's mission and values. So the statement is couched in terms of consistency with mission and values, but if you go down the list of demands, you'll see that every single one of them has been met to some degree. One that actually concerns me quite a lot, which hasn't gotten much attention, is the definition of anti-Semitism. This is really interesting issue because many people across the ideological spectrum, including Chris Rufo, whom we discussed a while ago, are quite opposed to using this particular definition, which claims that the application of double standards to Israel is itself anti-Semitic.
We can link to this. This is the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism, which comes with a set of examples that illustrate anti-Semitism that people are objecting to because the examples could be conceived as inconsistent with freedom of expression.
That's exactly right. So people who care about freedom of expression, and I got to give credit to some people who are very strong defenders of Israel, including Eli Lake, who have recently made very strong statements opposed, for example, to the deportation of Mahmoud Khalil.
I'm very glad to hear that. I didn't know that Eli Lake had spoken to
this. This was a very, very outspoken statement on X.
I'll look it up.
And he says you should. Yeah, it'll be worth linking to it. And he says, and he finds this person abhorrent, as you can imagine, given what you know about Eli Lake. But he says that unless he's convicted, unless he's charged with and convicted of a crime, this is very un-American. What's being done is very un-American. And he's not the only one. There are many, many people actually on the American right who are very, very uncomfortable with this way of handling ideas that they find unpalatable. Now, going back to the concessions and the consternation. The capitulation, rather, and the consternation. So, for example, the statement by President Armstrong talks about 36 special officers who are being given training and will have powers of arrest and removal. She talks about a bunch of regional studies departments, including MESAAS, but also including other regional studies departments that are going to be placed under a special vice provost. So, avoiding the term receivership, but it does seem pretty close to that. That's interference in the internal governance of the departments. She talks about having external reviewers of admissions policies. She talks about what else was demanded. She talks about the definition. So this is very interesting, given our previous conversations on self-censorship and public discourse. But she says that Columbia will adopt a definition of anti-Semitism that was advanced by a task force report, internal task force report, late last year. I think it was in the August of last year.
Adopt that definition for what purpose? Disciplining students?
No, I mean this is left ambiguous. So this is really the crux of the matter. So the task force mentioned that the application of double standards, for example, demanding divestment or disengagement with Israel without demanding it also of other countries that may be engaged in human rights violations of various kinds is perceived as anti-Semitic by a number of students on campus. And I think this is correct. It is perceived that way. But the task force is very clear that the reason for this definition is to help the university develop training and educational materials to make people aware of the way in which these comments are perceived, rather than for disciplinary purposes. But of course, the demand by the federal agencies for the adoption of this definition is precisely for its use in disciplinary procedures. If you classify something as anti-Semitic for any purpose, the next step would be to suppress that speech and to discipline people who engage in it. Now, that's left ambiguous in President Armstrong's statement, but I imagine that the adoption of this task force definition, which has a lot of overlap with the IHRA definition that you mentioned, is for purposes that were not intended by the task force. So sorry if that's a bit convoluted.
Yeah, I have the impression that we're splitting hairs here.
Okay.
I can't say, without offending a bar against anti-Semitism, that I think the university should divest from financial support of what I believe to be genocide being perpetrated by the whatever. These are not my beliefs. These are just hypothetical, but I can't say that.
That's right. So what the task force was saying was that, not that you can't say that, they're very clear that you should absolutely have the right to say that, but that students and faculty should be made to understand that some people will hear that as anti-Semitic. That was the task force position.
Okay, that is in keeping with the kinds of conventional diversity, equity, and inclusion instruction that you might imagine would be a part of an orientation program for students or whatever.
I think so.
Faculty should be aware when they're in the classroom that their student sensibilities are such and such and take that into account.
Yeah.
That's all fair.
But think about this, Glenn. The phrase "all lives matter" is perceived by people, many people, with some justification as a racist dog whistle, partly because it's often used that way. But to then engage in any kind of disciplinary action for somebody using that expression would be, to my mind, a very blatant violation of free speech and academic freedom. It's just
indeed.
So one can think about lots of examples that have nothing to do with this particular issue that that would go against the most basic understanding of academic freedom.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So this is a concern to me. So the concession with regard to the definition is a concern to me. I think other people will focus on other types of concessions, but this is one that actually means a lot to me. I've been thinking, as you know, about messages and meanings. I'm working on a book on this. I'll be on leave next year at Stanford, trying to write up some of these ideas. But you and I have talked many times about what expressions mean and how the process of selective adoption and abandonment of certain phrases, like "all lives matter," can lead to an entrenchment of particular meaning.
It's such a subtle and interesting point, I think, a sociolinguistic point. The literal meaning and the effective meaning are not the same thing. I mean, a thesaurus might tell me these words mean the following, but in a socialized context, the people who are speaking those words, who are known to have other views, will imbue those words with states' rights. Would be an example. There are, of course, real issues in constitutional law about the limits of the federal government over and against the state's prerogatives, et cetera. But the meaning of states' rights in American political history has been joined at the hip with the segregationist efforts to inhibit the imposition of federal mandate over their discriminatory practice. And likewise, from the river to the sea is a phrase that could be perfectly interpreted without it having any anti-Jewish genocidal intent. But given that it's used by various actors whose genocidal intent is presumed, taints the phrase in a certain way that no one who's aware of these external actors can use the phrase without being subjected to the possibility that they intended something which they may or may not have actually intended.
Exactly right. But what interests me actually is the process by which contested meaning then gradually moves in one direction to another, to a sort of a uniformity of understanding. So for example, if we go back again to the All Lives Matter example, there was a time when this was used in the same sentence as Black Lives Matter. So, people like Hillary Clinton, people like Martin O'Malley, Bernie Sanders even, I think, would say things like, Black Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, All Lives Matter. This kind of thing would roll off the tongue without much of a problem. And there was a point in time when I think it was Martin O'Malley who said this, and within 24 hours apologized for saying it. He was called uh, insensitive or bigoted, or I don't remember exactly what, but he apologized for it. And then there was a bit of a puzzlement. People like Mitt Romney, for example, were really puzzled as to why he's apologizing for saying something like that. So that was a moment in time in which the meaning was not generally understood. Maybe it still isn't to some extent, but once you end up with O'Malley apologizing for saying all lives matter, you get a process that is put in place. You get a process of selective, what I call selective adoption and abandonment. And people who don't want to be seen as bigoted, because he was accused of being bigoted, stop using the phrase, which means, again, to use the logic of your self-censorship paper, the meaning itself changes. So it starts to be seen actually as a racist dog whistle, because those who continue to adopt it are comfortable with that interpretation.
Yeah.
And that can lead others to adopt it, opportunistically. You actually want to engage in that kind of message with plausible deniability and so on. So then the meaning becomes entrenched. And it's very interesting how, these things just happen everywhere. You've got an example from Chicago, your hometown, from about 100 years ago, where there was a community of assassins, I think, ethnically Italian. I forget the name of, this is in a book by Adler. And, if somebody was testifying with regard to a homicide in court and someone came in and waved a red handkerchief, they would immediately stop. What does the waving of a red handkerchief have to do with anything? It was perceived quite correctly as a mortal threat. It was, you'd be killed if you just, and if you continued speaking about this, and the witness would then shut up immediately. For example, so that's a message that carries a meaning that doesn't seem to have anything to do with its literal content. And this is the kind of thing I've been interested in for a long time, but I think I've become keen on exploring in a bit more depth, especially because of expressions like from the river to the sea. Exactly how they come to be endowed with different meanings, and then how those meanings then evolve based on who decides to adopt and abandon them.
How bad is the anti-Semitism problem at Columbia, at Barnard, Columbia, in your opinion?
I think that most people, students, faculty, are not anti-Semitic in the slightest. That's my view. But there have been incidents that are quite clearly anti-Semitic, and the one that I mentioned in my post from this morning is the interruption of a class on the history of modern Israel early in the semester, first week of classes, where a group of students disrupted a class and circulated flyers. And those flyers actually were quite grotesque. They involved violent imagery, a boot stomping on a Star of David, an Israeli flag burning, and various statements that are crude and that I won't repeat here. But so you have examples of these, and of course, given the social media landscape we live in, they get amplified and distributed, and so my answer to your question is it's there. There are examples of actually, very distressing, very grotesque examples of anti-Semitism, but they are rare, in my opinion. and those people who are not part of the community view these things with disproportionate frequency. They're not really witnessing the day-to-day activities of faculty and students, which have nothing to do with that. And so they take an outsized place in the imagination of those who are forming opinions about Columbia and about Barnard and about higher education in general. So I would say it's there. There are plenty of examples of it, but I would say that its perceptions of its presence in the country at large is possibly out of proportion with its prevalence.
Let me play the devil's advocate here for a minute.
Yeah.
So, supposing the U.S. invades Iraq in 2003, and I don't like it, and I go on campus and I have a rally and I burn an American flag and I say the empire, it's a fascist, militaristic, whatever. What would happen to me? Nothing.
That's right.
I'm protected by explicit Supreme Court rulings. So the burning an American flag is not a punishable offense. It's an expression of sentiment. But if I burn an Israeli flag and I upset my Jewish students and faculty members of my community because it intimidates them, it makes it seem as if I'm anti-Zionist, I'm pro-Hamas, that's going to be enjoined. How can that be justified?
I take your point. Let me distinguish between the flag burning and the boot stomping on the Star of David. Star of David is not a symbol that is exclusively associated with Israel. It's associated with the religion. So
fair point.
So that I think is different. That I think it's more reasonable to describe that as being quite clearly anti-Semitic. It seems like it to me.
Mm-hmm.
But your point is well taken. This is addressed squarely by Eli Lake's tweet. He considers Khalil to be an apologist for a terrorist group, and despite that, he thinks that unless he's committed a crime, that he ought not to be deported. That he ought to have due process, and that the speech alone, even support for a terrorist organization, does not warrant this kind of treatment. And the fact that he happens to be a green card holder rather than an American citizen is not really relevant to our judgment of this fact. And I think that this is an important point. I think that we should think about why we have and we value the First Amendment. I think there's two ways to look at it. One way is to say, look, American citizens have certain rights. This is one of them. People who are not citizens, who may be visiting the country, don't have those rights. And so it's okay to treat people differently based on their status, their citizenship status. The other way to look at it is, we have the First Amendment because it's good for us, because the freewheeling debate that it encourages, the ability to voice the most extreme positions, can actually be instructive, can teach us something. Engaging with those views can help us understand our own views, and so on. The arguments are very familiar to you. If the reason that we have and we value the First Amendment is because it does something very good for us, even when we have to learn, even when we have to listen to some things that are deeply unpleasant, then whether or not someone is a citizen becomes irrelevant. Anybody who's making a statement that has, political valence and that challenges us to think about our own preconceptions has value. And that's a very different way to think about free speech, in my opinion. And that's the view that Lake is advancing. He absolutely detests the speech. But if one takes the point of view that it's part of the American tradition because it's good for America, then the citizenship status becomes irrelevant. And that's my position.
I was under the impression that the protections of the Bill of Rights did apply universally to residents in the United States, regardless of their citizen. Congress shall make no law is a prohibition against making a law that would bear on anybody, not only citizens.
Well, that's true, Glenn. But there's also an act of Congress that allows for the deportation of green card holders if the Secretary of State were to decide that some of their speech or their actions is contrary to U.S. foreign policy interests, and that ought to be unconstitutional based on the argument that you just made, but it hasn't been found to be. So that law is on the books. Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, can decide that somebody has said something that is contrary to U.S. foreign policy interests, and the law allows him to deport them, even if they're a green card holder. So, yeah, there are conflicting statutes here. And I think it has to be resolved. And I think actually it's a very good thing that the courts are looking at this.
I want to ask, as we get to the close here, about the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian and African Studies. I have the impression, and I don't know it well, this department, that it's distinguished. The tradition of inquiry into international affairs and a kind of development studies and Middle Eastern study, the great Edward Said's legacy, Columbia University, the very distinguished historian Rashid Khalidi is a member of the history department's faculty there at Columbia University. So the idea that the department would go into, as it were, quasi-receivership is striking, given that I think in the community of a global community of scholars inquiring into these matters, Columbia has a distinguished pedigree. So how do we square that? Whose authority would a vice provost overruling the faculty's decisions about appointments or curriculum matters or whatnot on Middle Eastern matters, on whose authority would it rest? External expertise, contrary to that cultivated in the development of that department? The people with tenure in that department, don't they have books? Haven't those books been vetted by university presses? Aren't they not subject to review, et cetera? I mean, now, if you told me they were just simply second-rate scholars, that would be one thing. But if they believe in settler colonialism as a metaphor for explaining certain historical and political developments, and that's endorsed by a plurality of qualified people in refereeing positions around the planet. Why isn't that the last word about what gets taught and what gets published?
It should be, Glenn. It should be. And you're right that this is really one of the most distinguished departments of its type globally. People may not like what's being taught there or what the scholars are writing in their books, but I think it's a hugely important part of the debate on such matters. And the silencing of those voices is going to be costly to people, even those who may disagree with them, because these voices end up not being silenced, right? They will make themselves heard one way or another. But I can't answer your question as to what purpose is being served by putting this department under the supervision of a special vice provost. I can't see any good that would come out of it, or any justification for it at all. And there are people in the department, I don't know many of them. One of my colleagues at Barnard is a member of the department. But the scholarship of those people who I do know, it certainly may be controversial, but it's also vital. I think it has to be engaged with. After October 7th happened, Glenn, I tried to listen. I tried to get a range of views, listen to people, no matter how extreme they were thought to be by their opponents. And so I listened to Eli Lake debate Norman Finkelstein on Noam Dorman's podcast, the Comedy Cellar podcast. I listened to a almost 5-hour debate on the Lix Friedman podcast involving Finkelstein again with Moeen Rabbani on one side and Benny Morris and Destiny on the other.
Wow.
I listened to Rashid Khalidi on Noam Dorman's podcast and so on. And I found a lot of that actually quite enlightening. There wasn't much common ground. That's for sure. I mean, the people were taking positions that were really diametrically at odds with each other, except for a few moments of agreement. But for me, it was a learning experience. I learned things that I feel are important for me to understand and evaluate and predict what's going on in the world. And I think that there are scholars in Columbia's Middle Eastern studies that are making very valuable contributions to these conversations, regardless of whether one agrees or disagrees with them. I think the same is true actually of the proponents, the early original proponents of critical race theory. I think that I just came across an article, a fascinating article by Skip Gates in the New Republic from 1993, where he was objecting to the idea that words are similar to physical violence. So I think there was a book. I think there was a book called "Words That Wound." That may have been the title that he was engaging with. And these were the early contributors of critical race theory. I forget. Kimberly Crenshaw was one of the contributors, but I think it was Richard Delgado, a couple of others. I'm forgetting the names, but these are the sort of the leading lights. The people who first started to make arguments that frankly I disagree with about words and physical violence being not necessarily as distinct from each other as we normally understand them to be. I take the opposite position, which is shared, for example, by Killer Mike, in his keynote for Fire a couple of years ago, or Chinamanda Ngozi Adichie in her BBC Right lecture, which is that yes, words can wound, but actually the distribution of powers of expression is less unequal than the distribution of wealth and power in other dimensions, and that free speech is actually something that serves an egalitarian purpose. So I disagree, but I mean the idea that volume, Words That Wound, I hope I got the title correctly, ought to have been suppressed, or that those authors should not have been engaged with, or that their scholarship is in some ways shoddy and unworthy of being housed in a major research university. I reject that completely. I think those were important ideas that we need to engage with and come to a position on.
Now, what about the complaint that, it's a distinguished department and they have a certain point of view? The problem is that's the only point of view that the students get exposed to when they take those courses, and there should be a counterpoint, a voice within the department that provides a more sympathetic interpretation of the history and the politics for the Zionist project.
I think there should be. Whether there is or not, I'm not sure. One of the departments that's also been placed under this special vice provost is a Department of Jewish Studies, and they, there are initiatives. Now, people can go to the statement by the president and look for details, but there are attempts to involve scholars on these fields, to have some sort of cross-pollination across departments, so that they can be a richer mix of ideas that students are exposed to. I'm in favor of that. But that doesn't require subordination of a department in this way, and humiliation, frankly.
Yeah,
I think this is really unfortunate. My view is that it's possible that President Armstrong thinks that this will be enough to get the funding restored. I'm very pessimistic about that. I don't think so. Again, based on the idea that the goals of people who are putting forward these challenges go well beyond eradication of antisemitism on campus. They have very little to do with antisemitism, in fact. But if she's right, if President Armstrong is right, and maybe she knows trustees or alumni who are involved with the administration, then what she's done may come to be seen as a strategic retreat rather than an abject surrender. That's a possibility. Because Glenn, I think there's no doubt that American colleges and universities are world leading. We produce a product for which there is almost insatiable global demand. We contribute to a balance of payments by exporting. Our tuition revenues and living expenses are exports. Allows us to import consumer electronics and a whole bunch of other things from the rest of the world. And the research and development, ecosystem around universities is a vital part of our productivity growth and innovation. So there may be people in the administration, as in the case of tariffs, who say, "Look, don't kill the golden goose here."
Yeah.
And in that case, President Armstrong's gambit may work out. I'm quite pessimistic, but I'll wait and see. I'll withhold judgment.
What do you think of the analogy that some have drawn? I don't know if you've drawn it in your own writing, between this moment in American history in terms of political interference with higher education and the situation in Germany in the 1930s with the rise of Hitler and the politicization of German universities.
Yeah, this is fascinating. There's somebody called Niels Gilman who also was very prescient last year, well before the election, about what's going to happen. And he's got a Substack newsletter. And he points out that there is no doubt at all that in the 1930s, at 1933, German universities were world leading. Research universities in Germany were without comparison. People would go there if they wanted to study with the pinnacle of their professions in many, many fields. In fact, that's where Du Bois went
to
Berlin.
1890s.
Yeah. But he was not alone in that at all. But it was destroyed in a matter of in less than a decade because of the government intervention, the rooting out of Jewish academics in particular. This has been called Hitler's gift to the Allies. You've got Einstein and Max Born. You've got Hannah Arendt. You've got Albert Hirschman, whom we have discussed. I mean, the kind of people
John von Neumann. Well, he wasn't German.
John von Neumann.
He was
John von
Austrian.
Neumann. Yes, John von Neumann. I mean, the list goes on. Erwin Schrödinger, the physicist. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And the Germans, the Nazis, not only persecuted Jewish academics, they also persecuted the leftists, the Social Democrats in Germany at that time. And so a bunch of those folks who were not Jewish were also forced to leave. Destroyed the German universities and is in some ways the basis for American dominance from the post-war period. A whole bunch of those folks actually came here.
Yeah.
So I think that analogy, I don't want to push it too far. These analogies with Nazi Germany are always a little bit fraught and sometimes overused. But I think it's a case that's worth studying, actually. It's quite possible. I'll say one last thing. I know we're running out of time, but I was trying to think about what might happen in the future if America loses its global dominance of higher education. What would replace it? And I can think of 3 countries that have the resources to actually build something that would be as large, as efficient, as capable, of generating an ecosystem of ideas. And that would be China, Saudi Arabia, and Norway, because the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is about $1.5 trillion. I think it's more than the combined endowments of all American universities. Saudi Arabia and China are not hospitable places for freedom of speech and academic expression, in my view, at the moment. And that leaves me with Norway. And Norway actually, just trying to think outside the box here, Norway actually has the resources, partly through its sovereign wealth fund, to take global research leadership if it manages to attract people who become disaffected with American universities. I don't think the prospects are. I don't think the likelihood is that high, but the possibility intrigues me. And I'm just trying to think if people are pushed too far, the entire infrastructure might collapse and something else will rise up somewhere else in its place.
Well, we shall see. Norway. The winters are kind of rough.
they own a huge chunk of the American stock market, and Sweden, of course, right next door, has an incredible tradition, at least in economics.
In economics, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, Rajiv, good talking with you. We should do it again sometime soon. My guest, Rajiv Sethi, professor at Barnard College, Columbia University, and author of the Imperfect Information newsletter at Substack. Thanks for joining us, Rajiv.
Thank you, Glenn.